In this lesson, we're going to be discussing the increment and decrement operators. Our lesson objectives, we're first going to learn the increment operator, then we're going to learn the decrement operator, and then learn the distinction between the two different increment operators and the two different decrement operators. So although they look the same, there is a difference between the two increment operators and the two different decrement operators. Alright, so this is again, I provided you with a cheat sheet with both the increment and decrement operators. So to increment a value by 1, you simply put two plus signs next to the variable. So let's say if I declare an integer named integer x, and I set that equal to 1. If I want to increase the value by 1 to make it 2, then I add the plus plus either after it or before it. Now, what I want to tell you is that, and what I told you in the lesson objective, is that there is a difference between this and this. What this does is that it increments it after it reads x, whereas the one here increments it and then reads x. Although that doesn't make sense now, you'll see with the print statement how that example shows how much of a difference that makes in our program. And the decrement operator is pretty much the same thing as the increment operator, but legitimately the opposite. So instead of adding 1, we're now subtracting 1. And similarly with the different position of the plus plus sign, the two different minuses signs have a different meaning in terms of what context they're being used in. So let's learn the distinction between putting the operator before and after the variable. So in our code, I declared a value called integer x is equal to 419. So that is the value that we have stored inside variable x. And then I have the print statement saying, hey, print out x and then increment the value. So what it reads it as, hey, I need to print out the value x. So it prints out 419, and then it increments the value by 1. So now, instead of 419, 420 is now stored within x. But that is after it prints it, because the plus operator, the increment operator, comes after the value x. So it prints out x first, and then increments it by 1. That's why when we print out x again, but without the increment operator, it prints out 420, because we incremented after we print out the first variable x. But let's say if we put the plus sign, or the operator rather, before the x. So I have the exact same thing, but I changed the operator to come before the x, and see what happens. So I declared the same variable, integer x, and I signed the same value, 419. But instead of putting the operator before, or rather after the x, I put it before. So what the print statement is saying, first we got to increment it. So we're first incrementing it before we print it. So now x is now 420. 420 is now x, and that is before it prints it. So now when it prints out x, it's going to print out 420, and it also prints out 420 again, because that is the new value of x. So whereas in our previous example, the operator comes after the x, it first prints out x and then increments it. That's why we get two different numbers here. But in this scenario, where we put the operator before printing x in the first print statement, the value is the same. So it's basically in terms of what happens in chronological order. So in this case, it's incrementing it, then printing it. Printing it, then incrementing it. And the same applies with the decrement operator. So I have integer x is equal to 421. And what it's doing is that it first prints out our original variable, our initial assignment, which is 421, and then it decrements it. So it prints out 421, and then it decreases it by 1. That's why we have two different values. When we print it a second time without the decrement operator, it comes out as 420, because we have decremented it in the previous print statement, but after we printed it for the first time. So the first time we print it, it's 421, because that is the first thing that comes up in chronological order. And the next thing is we decrement it. So then this becomes 420, and then when we print it out, it becomes 420 in the second print statement. Now, let's see what happens when we put the operator before the variable. So again, I have the same value. Integer x is equal to 421. And then it's printing it out, and it first decrements it. So now the value changes before it prints it the first time. So the compiler is like, all right, we got to decrement 421. We have to decrement x. So integer x is now subtracted by 1. 1 is subtracted from 421. So now this becomes 420, and then it prints it out. So now 420 gets printed, and since that's the new value within x, 420 is still printed when we access it in the second print statement. So let's go into the compiler and test both of these both the increment and decrement operators. So we're in the compiler, and let's first test out the increment operator. So we declare an integer x, and that is equal to 419. So now what I'm going to do is do system.out.println, and what I'm going to do first is I'm going to print out 419, and then I want to increment the value of x. So I first want to print out x like it is, like it's assigned in the initial declaration and assignment, and then I want to increase it by 1. So the first thing it does, it prints x and then increments. And then I'm going to put a second print statement to show you that the change has been made. All right, compile and run. And we get two different numbers. And the reason why, again, is because it prints out the initial one first. It sees x first, and it prints out 419 because that is the initial assignment. And then it sees the increment operator. It increments the value of x to 1. So now 419 has become 420 at the end of the print statement. So when we access x again, it's going to be 420. So now let's see what happens when I put the increment operator before the value, or before variable x. So now what it does is that it increments and then prints x. And as you can see, it prints out the same number, because what happens? 419 is incremented by 1. Variable x is incremented by 1 because that is the first thing the print statement sees, and then it prints out x. And whenever we access x again, it's going to refer back to the increment because we incremented it. So now 419 is no longer existing in x. It's 420 is now in x. Now let's see the decrement operator. Alrighty, so I declare an integer x, and I set that equal to 421. Now what this print statement is saying is saying, hey, I'm going to first print out x. So it prints out x first, and then decrements. So let's see what happens. We get two different numbers because it prints out x. 421, it prints out 421. Then it decreases x by 1. So x is no longer 421, it's 420. Even though it didn't print out 420 within the print statement, 420 is now the value within x. So when we re-access it later, x is now 420. Now let's see what happens when we put the decrement operator before the variable x. And now we get the same value for both print statements. And the reason why is because it decrements first. The print statement says, hey, I'm going to decrement this thing before I print it. So it decrements it, whatever. 421 is now 420, and then it prints out 420. And then whenever we access x, it's going to be 420 because 421 doesn't exist within x anymore. After we decrement it, after we subtract 1, it's 420 whenever we access it. And that wraps up our video on both incrementing and decrementing operators. This is actually a very important component in our future lesson regarding for loops. It allows us to basically run our loops, which I'll show you in our for loop section. But as of right now, I want you to get a rough, or rather a good strong power, or rather ability to utilize increment and decrement operators within our program. So that wraps up our video. Thank you for watching.